welcome to this review of my Qtronix Scorpius 104 keyboard. This keyboard recently made a cameo in my MX5000 video in which it played the role of a decent rubber dome board, but it definitely deserves a video of its own because it's actually pretty cool. Now, during last week's Cherry MX Brown review, I apparently kind of shocked part of the keyboard community when I said I know some rubber dome boards that are better than that. Some people kind of misinterpreted that as all rubber domes are better than MX Brown, which is of course not the case. Yes, I think MX Brown is immensely disappointing with no real tactility to speak of, but it's still a mechanical key switch. It's still a big improvement on a bog standard rubber dome board. However, not all domes are equal, and some are a bit special, and this is one of them. See, it might be a rubber dome board, but I maintain that anyone who just rejects rubber dome boards out of hand simply hasn't tried a great one yet, and this one is definitely great despite also having several flaws. There's also a black Sega branded version of this keyboard which looks much more kick-ass, but which is otherwise basically the same. I've had it for a while and I found it at the recycling centre for 50 pence, which is probably what it cost to make, but I'm quite happy with it, to be honest. The construction is pretty flimsy. It's basically a hollow plastic shell with some membranes in it. It's light and it flexes quite a bit, as you can see. There are two flip-out feet on the bottom, but they're a rather cheap design, and one of them is actually broken off, which is a shame, especially because it's not a common design, so none of the spare feet I have fit it. Behind one of the feet is space for an ATXT switch, but for some reason they spelt it as APXT, and there's no actual switch there. And to top it off, here is the model sticker of the keyboard, Qtronix Corporation model Scorpius 104, made in China. It's also got these funky split indicator lights, and there's even space for a fourth one, although it's not in use. The keycaps are also very cheap, being thin ABS with lasered legends. Lasering is more durable than pad printing, but not as high spec as dye sublimation or double shot injection molding. ABS itself is prone to yellowing and losing its texture after periods of heavy use, becoming shiny in the process. As you can tell, it has yellowed, but it hasn't become shiny yet. As you might have noticed, it uses a big ass enter and a tiny backspace key, which is kinda annoying. Other than that, it's a standard full-size layout though. The biggest selling point of the keyboard is therefore the switches, because the rest is very meh, obviously. Thankfully, this is where the keyboard largely doesn't disappoint. They're dome with slider switches, which are an augmented type of rubber dome switches. They're generally more refined than, and can, if done well, eliminate several problems common to normal rubber domes. I've made a mega review in which I did short pieces about a whole range of dome with slider designs, which can range from very simple to bizarrely complicated, and I found that these widely vary in quality. Click on the link to check out that video now if you're interested. Compared to a standard dome board, these switches are much snappier and more tactile, and they're very smooth and satisfying to use. They don't have any of the mushiness of traditional rubber domes, and in all honesty, it's a pretty damn nice switch to use. At this point, some people will probably be wondering two things. How do the switches stack up against BTC dome with slider, and how does it compare to Topre? Now, for those who are wondering what I'm on about, I've mentioned on several occasions that BTC's dome with slider switches are just about the best rubber I've seen around, and I did a whole separate review on them. Again, click the link to check that one out. Those are also really snappy and satisfying and not mushy at all, and they're fairly high spec as far as dome switches go because they're actually conductive domes over a real PCB rather than a dome mat over a set of membranes, which gives them a distinct, clean key feel and an uncharacteristically loud typing sound for a rubber dome board. These Scorpius domes are much simpler. They do work with a rubber dome mat and they don't have a PCB, using membranes instead. But they must use some kind of really nice rubber because they feel just as good, if not slightly better, even than the BTC switches. The overall type of feel is pretty comparable, but the Scorpius might be just a tiny bit more refined than the BTCs. One issue, however, is that some of the larger keys like Tab, Caps Lock, the Control and Alt buttons, etc., they're not stabilized, and that means they bind quite badly on off-center key presses, something that the BTCs don't have. The sound is also quite different. As I mentioned, the BTC is very loud for a dome board, possibly the loudest dome design I know, but it's also a kind of rattly sound, whereas the Scorpius domes don't have that. The Scorpius sounds much fuller than the BTC, and I think this is the most important advantage that the Scorpius has over the BTC in my opinion. I'll show you what the two sound like next to each other real quick. There we go. That said, sometimes the cheapness of the design does shine through a bit, because I've noticed that on a few occasions, not many, but still, the input from a key would electrically jam, so it wouldn't stop outputting that key, even if you tried to unfuck it by pressing the key a couple of times. This has only happened during gaming, presumably because of prolonged keystrokes, but it's annoying enough that I'd recommend the BTC switches over these, as the BTCs never missed a beat for me. By the way, the switches actually kind of resemble BTC dome with slider switches, especially because although this is the Alps mount version, there is also a version that uses Cherry MX mount, just like BTC dome with slider. As for how it compares to Topre, the truth is that Topre is simply a better switch from a design perspective, as they use much more refined technology, being capacitance driven and possessing inherent N-key rollover, being more durable and reliable, having much better build quality, as well as being able to actuate part way down a key press rather having to bottom all the way out, which is arguably the biggest advantage Topre has over all other dome designs. The good thing about this is that it makes typing feel very relaxed and effortless, as other rubber domes require you to mash the keys all the way down in order to register a key press. That said, if you disregard all these extra benefits, in terms of actual key feel only, I still find myself preferring the Scorpius domes over the Topre switches, despite everything. Topre is nice, but these Scorpius domes are much snappier, and I found that the more I use Topre, the less I like them, while the more I use BTC and Scorpius domes, the more I like them. I even prefer the sound over that of the Topre boards. The Topre thock sound is nice and full and all, but it's also a little bit subdued for my liking. There's no way I'd actually recommend this over a Topre board though. That would be ridiculous, except perhaps as a money-saving alternative. The Scorpius boards appear to be nowhere near as common as the BTCs, which are fairly ubiquitous and which are a nice test bed for people who want to try a Topre demo without spending a massive wad of cash on them. If you can find one of these floating around for cheap, I highly recommend checking them out, but don't forget, it's still just a rubber dome board, so don't pay anything you could buy even a cheap mechanical keyboard for, because obviously that'd still be a lot better. If you can find one floating around for up to a tenner or something, sure, give it a go, you might well like them a lot. I'd say the BTCs are better boards overall though. The sound is not as nice, but they feel almost as good, and they're just much better build and more dependable boards I reckon, and they're more common and easy to get hold of to boot. So, summing up the keyboard, I'd say that although this keyboard is cheap enough to evoke images from the sucky sucky yum yum $5 scene from Full Metal Jacket, I find it hard to hate on this thing. It never set out to prove anything to anyone, and yet it does, because the switches honestly feel 10 times better than any of the current Cherry MX Brown based switch designs, so it feels like the real deal. Sure, it's built like crap, and it's not the most reliable I've ever seen, but the switches feel nice, and it makes a good sound, and sometimes that's enough. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.